The history of American true crime is often defined by geography. We speak of the Boston Strangler, the Milwaukee Cannibal, the Freeway Phantom. The location gives the killer a name, a territory, and a mythology. But what happens when the territory isn't a city block or a neighborhood, but 1,000 miles of asphalt cutting across the entire heartland of the nation? The man we know only as the I-70 killer didn't prey on a city. He preyed on the road itself. He turned the promise of the American Interstate, the promise of freedom, commerce, and connection, into a cold, dark corridor of violence. This is a story about the terrifying realization that the infrastructure built to link us together also provided the perfect escape for a killer operating in the shadows. The year was 1992. The American Midwest was a landscape of optimism and expansion, a vast network of highways facilitating the country's commerce and connecting countless small towns to major metropolitan hubs. It was an era before pervasive security cameras, before ubiquitous cell phones, and before DNA databases became the ultimate arbiter of truth. It was the perfect hunting ground for a killer who understood anonymity and speed. The beginning of the spree was subtle, easy to dismiss as an isolated local tragedy. It was Wednesday, April 8, 1992, in Indianapolis, Indiana. The location was a Payless Shoe Source in the Brookville Road Plaza. This shopping center was conveniently located near the intersection of I-74 and, more importantly, Interstate 70, the main artery running east-west across the country. The victim was 26-year-old Robin Fuldauer, the store manager. Robin was not just a dedicated employee, she was a vibrant, ambitious young woman. She was a recent graduate of Indiana University, working hard to build a career in retail management. Her friends described her as bright, dedicated, and someone who was just beginning to find her footing in the world. She had plans to move up in the company, perhaps even to a corporate role. On that sunny Wednesday afternoon, Robin was working alone, managing the slow midweek traffic that characterizes strip mall retail. Around 1:30 p.m., the killer entered the store. The entire attack was over in minutes. It was swift, silent, and clinical. Robin was marched to the back storage room, an area away from the public eye, and executed with a single shot to the back of the head. The weapon used was small, chambered for a quiet .22 caliber round. When police found her body around 3:00 p.m., called by a concerned regional manager, they noted the bizarre, almost indifferent nature of the robbery. Less than $100 was taken from the cash register. The shelves were undisturbed, and the action was far too quick, too focused to be a panicked stick-up. The scene spoke volumes. This wasn't about the money, this was about the killing. Indianapolis detectives, initially assuming they had a botched robbery gone wrong, began their local investigation, completely unaware that the man responsible was already hundreds of miles away, moving along the very interstate that connected them to the rest of the Midwest. Just 3 days later, the crime exploded from a local tragedy into a multi-state nightmare. On Saturday, April 11th, the location was now Wichita, Kansas, over 500 miles southwest of Indianapolis. The setting was the La Bride d'Elegance bridal shop. Wichita sits on I-35, a major artery, but the killer had made the massive journey with frightening speed and precision. The victims here were the 32-year-old owner, Patricia Magers, and her 23-year-old employee, Patricia Smith. Both women were busy, working the busy Saturday rush. It was after 6 p.m., and the two women had stayed late, patiently waiting for a male customer to arrive and pick up a cummerbund for a wedding. When a slender white man with reddish hair and a peculiar bulky pistol appeared, they naturally assumed he was the customer they were expecting. They let him in. He murdered both women in cold blood. This scene provided the first and most crucial piece of investigative gold. Moments after the shooting, the actual customer, the one the women had been waiting for, arrived to pick up his cummerbund. He walked straight into the nightmare. He found the killer inside the store standing over the bodies. The suspect, holding his unusual weapon, calmly told the horrified man to go to the back room. The customer, his adrenaline spiking, refused. In a moment of sheer terror and instinct, he turned and fled the store, running for his life down the street, while the killer watched him go, and then, just as calmly, disappeared into the Wichita night. The witness was in a state of deep shock, and it took him over an hour to report the encounter, but his description proved invaluable. He detailed a white male, slender build, between 5'7" and 5'8", with light brown or reddish hair cut short, possibly with some beard stubble. Most importantly, he described the weapon, an oddly proportioned Uzi-like .22 caliber gun. Ballistics later confirmed that the bullets used to kill the 3 victims across 2 states came from the exact same firearm. This wasn't a random event. It was a serial killer, using the interstate as his personal killing field. The FBI was called in, and the hunt began for the man they quickly nicknamed the I-70 killer. The investigation was plagued from the start by acute jurisdictional issues. The killings were occurring in different states, different counties, with different police departments, each with its own procedures, communication methods, and political pressures. This lack of initial coordination allowed the killer to move and strike with impunity. While police scrambled to connect the dots between Indianapolis and Wichita, a gap of 50 hours between the crimes, the killer was already back on the road, watching the news reports of his own atrocities. The next victim fell 16 days later, and this time the target profile shifted. Or more accurately, the killer made a rare, tragic mistake. On April 27th, the spree moved to Terre Haute, Indiana, another city strategically located along I-70. The victim was 40-year-old Michael McCown, killed in his mother's shop, Sylvia's Ceramics. Michael was the only male victim in the entire spree. Michael was slightly built, wore his long hair in a ponytail, and was in the back of the store stocking shelves when the killer entered. The prevailing theory is that the killer, scouting the location from the outside, saw a figure with long hair in a store with a distinctly feminine name, Sylvia's Ceramics, and assumed his target was a woman. Michael was shot from behind while kneeling. Less than $50 was taken. The evidence reinforced the profile. The killer was targeting solitary women in small specialty retail stores, shoe stores, bridal shops, ceramics shops, gift shops, all easily accessible right off the interstate. And his primary motivation was the act of murder itself, not financial gain. The killer seemed to be escalating, or perhaps becoming more brazen in his movement. The final 2 confirmed murders happened in Missouri in the span of 4 days, bringing the total time of the known spree to exactly 29 days. On Sunday, May 3rd, just days after the McCown murder, 24-year-old Nancy Kitzmiller was killed while working alone at Boot Village, a footwear shop in St. Charles, Missouri. St. Charles is a suburb of St. Louis, positioned perfectly right off I-70. Nancy was a dedicated young woman who had offered to come in on her day off, so a co-worker could have the day free, a gesture of kindness that cost her her life. Customers found her dead in the back of the shop around 2:30 p.m. Just 4 days after that, on Thursday, May 7th, 37-year-old Sarah Blessing was murdered in her gift shop, the store of many colors, in Raytown, Missouri, near Kansas City. The geographic sweep was now complete. A nearly 1,000-mile stretch of the I-70 corridor had been terrorized. Sarah Blessing, a beloved figure in her community, was the final confirmed victim. At the Raytown scene, an adjacent video store owner saw the killer enter the store, heard a small muffled pop, the sound of the unique .22 caliber pistol, and watched the man calmly leave. A clerk from a nearby grocery store also spotted the suspect as he was making his way up a small hill, disappearing toward the interstate. These witnesses cemented the composite sketch. The man described as slender, pale, and carrying himself with a strange, purposeful confidence. 6 people were dead across 3 states, and then, as suddenly as he had appeared, the I-70 killer vanished. The spree ended, leaving behind a frantic multi-state cold case that would consume investigators for decades. One of the most enduring and critical pieces of evidence in the I-70 killer case is the weapon itself, the Erma Werke ET22. This was a German-made .22 caliber pistol with an unusually long barrel, specifically designed to look like a miniature Uzi or MP40 submachine gun. Investigators noted that only about 6,500 of these specific pistols were ever imported into the United States. This highly unique, rare firearm was not the weapon of choice for a common street criminal. It was a distinctive, almost collectible gun, valued by enthusiasts for its novelty and appearance. FBI profilers suggested that the killer likely had a strong, perhaps even emotional connection to this weapon. It may have been a family heirloom, a gift, or something he specifically sought out because of its militaristic appearance. It was not practical. It was known to jam easily and was notoriously unreliable. But it fit a psychological need, perhaps giving the small, slender man, the man described as unremarkable, a feeling of immense, absolute power. The profiling suggested the killer was likely fulfilling a deep-seated fantasy, possibly a sexual component to the violence, with the murders themselves being the climax, leading to a temporary cooling-off period before the urge became overwhelming again. They believed he was likely a local man in the Midwest who worked a nondescript job, but that he had the time and ability to travel significant distances, possibly using a truck or a vehicle associated with a traveling job. His knowledge of the strip malls and their proximity to the interstate suggested a clear, pre-planned method. The challenge of the I-70 killer case was fundamentally one of coordination and logistics. The speed and distance of the attacks immediately overwhelmed the traditional, localized structure of American law enforcement. In the 1990s, sharing ballistics data and witness profiles across state lines was a slow manual process, done largely by fax machine and phone calls. While the FBI was brought in, their role was initially advisory, and the lead investigators in Indianapolis, Wichita, and the various Missouri counties struggled to reconcile their own local procedures with the national scope of the problem. Early on, there was a major focus on individuals who owned the Erma Werke ET22. Thousands of leads were generated, pursuing every legal owner of the rare firearm. However, the gun could have been stolen, bought illegally, or even purchased far outside the Midwest. This line of inquiry, while exhaustive, proved to be a dead end. Detectives also chased the sketch. The witness in Wichita provided a clear, if adrenaline-fueled, description. A slender white man, 5'7" to 5'8", in his early to mid-30s with light or reddish-brown hair. He was often seen wearing glasses. This led to hundreds of false leads, including several transient people stopped along the interstate, but none panned out. The killer was described as having an uncanny calm, the ability to walk out of a store where he had just committed a double murder and simply vanish into traffic, a confidence that suggested either psychopathy or extensive preparation. One of the most promising yet inconclusive connections centered on a former shoe salesman. This individual, who had worked for a competitor of Payless, fit the physical description and had detailed knowledge of retail store layouts and security procedures. He had a history of violence and was known to travel extensively for his job. However, despite intense surveillance and questioning, investigators could never definitively place him at all the crime scenes, and the gun was never recovered. The difficulty of obtaining reliable, consistent information across 3 states and 5 different police forces ultimately hampered the early investigation, allowing the cooling-off period to stretch into years. As police focused on the I-70 corridor, the sheer randomness of the highway killings forced investigators to look backward and outward. The question became, was the I-70 killer a unique monster, or was he part of a terrifying, anonymous movement of transient predators who used the interstates to select and discard their victims? To answer that, we turn to the case that haunted Ohio for decades, the murder of Marcia King, known for 37 years as the Buckskin Girl. 11 years before Robin Fuldauer was killed in Indianapolis, the body of a young woman was found in a ditch alongside Greenlee Road in Troy, Ohio on April 24, 1981. Though technically a local road, it was located chillingly close to the nexus of the I-75 and I-70 network, a massive junction of American commerce and travel. The victim had been beaten and strangled. She was wearing a distinctive, beautiful buckskin poncho, which led to her immediate moniker, Buckskin Girl. For nearly 4 decades, she remained unidentified. She had freckles, reddish-brown braids, and was found without shoes, but her body was clean and well kept, ruling out long-term vagrancy. Investigators theorized she was a runaway or transient, murdered far from home and dumped quickly. Forensic pollen analysis, an advanced technique at the time, suggested she had spent time in Oklahoma and Texas in the months prior to her death, confirming her life was one spent on the road, near the very highways the I-70 killer would later use. Her lack of identity became a symbol of the American transient mystery. Every police sketch, every press release, was a dead end, a tragic ghost of the highway. But in 2018, everything changed. Investigators working with the newly formed DNA Doe project utilized a stored 1981 blood sample that had sat unrefrigerated for decades. Through sheer scientific tenacity and the innovative use of genetic genealogy databases, the same method that helped capture the Golden State Killer, they found a match. The Buckskin Girl was identified as 21-year-old Marcia King, who had disappeared from Little Rock, Arkansas. Her identification brought a crushing closure to her family, who had spent nearly 4 decades waiting for her return. Her father, John Sossaman, had even submitted his own DNA to genealogical sites, a quiet plea in a bottle, searching for his lost daughter. He passed away just 3 months before she was identified, never knowing her name had been restored. While Marcia King's identity was solved, her murder remains a cold case. Her killer, like the I-70 killer, vanished into the shadows of the American Interstate system. The fact that 2 separate serial crimes, one involving strangulation and the other a rare pistol, both occurred within a stone's throw of this major interstate corridor, highlights the terrifying reality. The highways were simply facilitating murder for multiple, unrelated predators. The sheer number of unidentified bodies found along the I-70 and I-75 corridors suggests a chilling pattern of unchecked violence. The I-70 killer vanished in May 1992, but investigators believe he may have simply moved south, following the main artery of American trucking and commerce. The focus of the case shifts now to Texas, where a chillingly similar, yet ballistically distinct series of retail murders occurred over a year after the last confirmed I-70 killing. In late 1993, a series of retail murders occurred in strip malls near interstates in Texas. The MO was almost identical to the I-70 killer, a lone, slender male targeting small specialty retail stores with solitary female clerks, often killing them in the back room and taking a negligible amount of cash. In September 1993, 32-year-old Marianne Glasscock was shot and killed in her store, the Emporium in Fort Worth, Texas. Then, in November of the same year, 22-year-old Amy Vess was killed at the Cash and Go in nearby Denton, Texas. Both women were petite, working alone in small stores, and were killed by a lone, slender male assailant who took very little money. The parallels were chilling and undeniable to Midwestern police. It fit the I-70 killer's signature almost perfectly. The Texas cases even include a female victim, 26-year-old Vicki Johnson, who survived being shot in the back of the head during a similar incident in Houston in 1994. Crucially, the Denton victim, Amy Vess, was killed with a .22 caliber weapon, and the killer was witnessed leaving the store and heading towards I-35, the highway that directly links the I-70 network down to Texas. However, the definitive ballistic link was missing. While the I-70 killer used the unique Erma Werke ET22, the gun used in the Texas killings was later determined to be a different .22 caliber firearm. To this day, investigators are split 50-50 on the connection. Was the Texas killer the I-70 killer who had simply switched weapons after the intense nationwide coverage of the Erma Werke pistol, a move designed to throw police off his trail? Or was this yet another unrelated serial killer operating under the same chilling MO, targeting vulnerable women in roadside shops, a terrifying duplication of violence facilitated by the interstates? The split in opinion underscores the inherent difficulty of tracking these transient murderers. The theory of the geographic switch suggests a calculated move. The I-70 killer, recognizing the pressure cooker he had created in the Midwest, migrated to a new, equally accessible territory to continue his spree, adapting his weapon choice for anonymity. The fear of the anonymous highway killer was not confined to the Midwest or the South. It stretched all the way to the Rocky Mountains and the Great Basin, demonstrating the continental scale of the threat and suggesting that the I-70 killer was just one high-profile example of a much wider problem. We turn now to the case of Vicki Lynn Perkins. In 1989, 4 years before the I-70 spree, the skeletal remains of 19-year-old Vicki Lynn Perkins were discovered in a remote, desolate area near a roadside in Emery County, Utah. This location is precisely where the I-70 corridor ends, connecting directly to I-15, which runs north and south through the western states. Vicky had gone missing from Portland, Oregon, a huge distance away. Her body, along with the bodies of several other young women and girls, was eventually linked to a larger, complex series of crimes known as the Great Basin murders. These victims were often transient, hitchhiking or traveling along the major highway routes of the West, I-80, I-70 and I-15, and were sexually assaulted, murdered, and dumped in remote areas accessible by road. The desolate nature of the terrain provided a near-perfect cover for killers who were constantly in motion. Though the MO and weapon were different from the I-70 killer, the underlying principle was the same. The killer used the vast, anonymous network of the interstates to select victims and dispose of the evidence. Truck drivers, drifters, and other individuals who spent their lives on the road became immediate suspects in this long, terrifying series. Law enforcement investigated potential links to known serial killers like Scott William Cox and Keith Hunter Jesperson, the Happy Face Killer, both of whom were truck drivers who preyed on victims across multiple states. While no definitive link was ever established between these larger, distinct sprees, the case of Vicky Lynn Perkins stands as a stark reminder that the danger on the road was not centralized. It was a nationwide epidemic, utilizing the interstates as a deadly backbone, with the I-70 killer representing the specific retail murder aspect of this phenomenon. The legacy of the I-70 killer remains profound, not only for the violence he committed, but for the systemic changes he inadvertently caused in law enforcement. The failure of communication in 1992 was a major catalyst for improving multi-jurisdictional task forces and eventually led to better integration of regional crime databases. Today, the search for the I-70 killer continues, fueling documentaries, podcasts, and books decades after the last confirmed murder. In 2021, spurred by the advances in DNA technology and genetic genealogy, a major multi-state task force was formally re-established, uniting detectives from all the affected jurisdictions: Indianapolis, Wichita, Terre Haute, St. Charles, and Raytown. The hope is that the killer, who would now be in his late 60s or 70s, may have left behind touch DNA at one of the scenes. This is the crucial 21st century advantage. The shell casings, found at multiple locations, were slated for modern testing, hoping to extract DNA evidence from the primer area or from trace biological material left at the scene, such as a drop of sweat or a stray hair. While initial testing has reportedly been inconclusive or disappointing, due to the age of the evidence and the limitations of forensic science in 1992, the detectives assigned to the case are committed to chasing every lead, no matter how cold. They are routinely reviewing old suspects and cross-referencing them against genetic genealogy databases, looking for a distant family match that could lead them to the man who terrorized the heartland. The psychological profile of the killer has also been refined over time. Experts now suggest he may have been a white male who worked a nondescript job involving travel, perhaps as a delivery driver, a long-haul trucker, or even a traveling salesman. His methodical planning, his use of the back room for execution, and his choice of solitary female victims in non-chain specialty stores all point to a man who was organized, meticulous, and who derived pleasure from the act of murder itself, the minor robberies merely being a pretense to delay discovery. He was a man who understood the geometry of escape, always near the asphalt, always moving, never settling long enough to become familiar. The 5 victims of the I-70 killer, Robin Fuldauer, Patricia Magers, Patricia Smith, Michael McCown, Nancy Kitzmiller, and Sarah Blessing, along with the enduring mystery of Marcia King and the vast terror of the Great Basin murders, reveal the dark side of American mobility. For a brief, terrifying period in the late 20th century, the American highway system was a place where life was cheap and escape was easy. These stories serve as a persistent, chilling reminder that a killer can still be out there, having long since traded the anonymity of the open road for the safety of a quiet, unexamined life, leaving behind only the echoing trauma of the interstate shadows and the endless question of who he was and why he chose the highway as his deadly domain.